There are issues, so I've asked the Department of Health to follow up. I know it's been reported about some of the labs. Traditionally, they only report the positives. Now, with COVID, we've instructed them to do the negatives. Most of them have done it, but I think as has been pointed out, there have been some labs that submitted 100% positives, and there's some labs that are doing that. Now, part of it is they want to get the positives out as quickly as possible so that people know, and the negatives can get backlogged. Sometimes they dump a bunch of negatives, but still, if you're actually going to use this percent positive as a metric, you kind of got to get all the negatives there as well. The other thing I've asked the Department of Health to look at is there was a case here in Central Florida where somebody, I think they were in their 20s, and they were in a motorcycle accident, and that was counted as a coronavirus death. And a lot of people are like, how is that possible? You get hit by a car, and then you're attributing it to coronavirus. And so I want them to go back and look. I think, though, the reason that's the case is because what CDC has said is anybody that tests positive, if they then die, that's a death amongst cases. But I think the public should know to say, okay, if somebody commits suicide, for example, and then they turn up positive, should that be attributed to the coronavirus? And for the perspective of the state's reporting, they're just going to keep doing it the CDC's way. But at least I think the public should know, how many of those types of fatalities there are. Because, we've had families, who've been a little frustrated that they had maybe an elderly relative who had a really chronic condition, was in hospice, and then got infected in hospice, and then that was being attributed to corona when they had Alzheimer's or some other things. And so people have had questions about it. So I think that it just needs to be, okay, here's what the CDC is requiring, here's what this means, and then here are maybe some instances in which clearly it was somebody that died with rather than died because of. And obviously, most of these cases, respiratory distress, you're dying because of. So I'm not diminishing that. But there are some of those cases, particularly when you start talking about things like car accidents, which I think people kind of just scratch their head and say, well, why would that be something that was due? And I think that the reason is because they are following CDC guidelines. And I think CDC was just like, well, instead of us parsing this and trying to figure out, why not just include it, then maybe you can go back and parse it later. So I understand why they did it, but I think sometimes people see that and they get a little frustrated and they wonder, okay, come on, that's not really what should be there. So, all right, one more question. Yes, sir.
Fox 35 News. We're hearing from a lot of people that they went to get tested, left for whatever reason early prior to getting tested, and then are getting a few days later positive test results. Can you explain why this?
So I've asked the health to look at that because I've heard it too. If you can give us, if people that have told you that are willing to provide their name, we're interested in investigating this because it's ridiculous. Some people sign up and then for whatever reason they don't go through with the test and then they just say you tested positive when you were not even swabbed. And I know like every time a test is run, there's a lot of money that goes to these labs. I mean, it's $100 a test. But for that to come back positive when there was no specimens submitted is problematic. So I've heard it enough to be concerned about it. And I would just say to the public, if you're somebody that this has happened to and you're willing to come forward and give us the details, because I think that needs to be corrected. I mean, how can you if somebody's just getting a test result without being swabbed, then what is that saying about some of the other stuff that's going on? I also want to know which labs is that happening at? I don't think it's happening at everyone, but if there's one or two that it is, it's a big, big problem. So.